The health care program that President Obama was able to get through in his first full year in office is a radical change for the U.S. economy. And what I'm here to do this afternoon with the second half of my presentation is again to tell you that I disagree that it's something the government ought to be in. And I will try to make a very plausible argument for more market solutions. And ultimately, I would agree with Dr. Ebling's conclusion that the best possible way to solve our health care crisis is to narrow that relationship. Instead of having a multiplicity of people and processes, we ought to set up a system where the customer can deal as closely with and directly with the health care provider as possible. It's a relationship we used to have in this country, and it's a relationship that has changed for a lot of different reasons. Probably the biggest movement toward health care as a benefit offered by companies came during World War II. And during World War II, you had a situation where there were wage and price controls across the United States. So it was illegal for a number of years to give employees pay increases because we were worried about inflation and the costs of building armaments to fight the Axis forces, the Italians, the Germans, and later the Japanese. And so we had wage and price controls, and a way to attract an employee from one company to another when you couldn't give wage benefits was to offer non-wage benefits. And so one of the biggest incentives was that companies began to offer health care benefits to their employees because technically it was not violating the law. You could argue it added to costs, it increased the price of what you paid for a good or a service, but it actually was a way to get around those laws. And so prior to World War II, health care as a benefit wasn't a major benefit, and by the 1960s, 1970s, most employees had some form of company-sponsored health care benefit. And so as you look at the issue that we're analyzing today and you think about where we're at, what you find is that the vast majority of Americans are pretty happy with their health care system. You know, the vast majority of people, based on survey after survey, are happy with a health care system if it happens to be Medicare or Medicaid, or they're happy with it if it happens to be a private health care system. And in fact, as you go through and you look at the data, initially, just over 50% in some way supported President Obama's move toward a national health care system, a single-payer system. And again, it was a move toward it. It wasn't exactly a single-payer system, but that's exactly what the Canadians said when the Canadian system evolved into a single-payer system like they have today. The difficulty that you have is that it was a process that was rammed through Congress. The president was very savvy from a political perspective. He knew he had the control of the House. He knew he had the control of the Senate. He was worried that he would lose it in the midterm elections, which he did lose the House and almost lost the Senate. So he had a real short window to get this through. And if you remember, a very famous comment on the health care plan was that it was almost 3,000 pages, and most people hadn't read it. And from the time it was submitted to the time the vote took place, it was less than 1 week. And there was no way that a congressman or a congresswoman, a congressperson was going to read that and understand it in detail, the complexities, the math, the regression analysis, the extrapolation of data as it relates to income and costs of health care, etc., and have any knowledge of what was in there literally in that short a period of time. Usually you have months to analyze it, and the president, for a lot of good reasons and political expediency, was successful at pushing it through. And the famous quote that I want to bring up is one by then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. Congresswoman Pelosi is from the San Francisco area and a big proponent of national health care. And she made a joking statement, but she was, in essence, quite serious when a reporter from the Wall Street Journal asked her, "What is in the bill?" And she laughed and she said, "Well, we'll have to pass it in order to find out." Well, it was passed, and then we began to take a look at the actual data and the actual cost. And the Congressional Budget Office changed its numbers regarding the cost because what they thought they were told and what they found out was in the bill was dramatically different. And the population went from roughly 51% supporting it, roughly 7% being neutral, and 42% opposing it, to today, most polls show somewhere between, depending on how you ask the question, 55 to 59% of Americans oppose President Obama's bill that's now law. And they oppose it because there is a realization that it's going to cost us a lot more than we first expected. And the second point is the freedom that people like and in many cases cherish about the current system will go away. And as Dr. Ebling pointed out, those who make the rule, those who have the controls in government make the rules and can change the rules. And what people are now seeing is that this notion that you can keep your own doctor, that you will be able to choose the hospital and the type of care that you have, that most people have under a private health care insurance, that is going to probably be impossible if we're going to keep health care costs under control and put limits on spending and try to use this to help reform the cost structure within health care and balance the budget. It's just not going to happen. And what many people are now worried about is the flexibility, the dynamics, the inventiveness, the innovativeness of the American healthcare system, which is the best in the world, will greatly suffer under a nationalized healthcare system, and simultaneously the cost controls that we expected to take place, even the Congressional Budget Office is saying they may not be what we had hoped to be, or they may not exist at all. So the promise of a better health care system is questionable at best, and I would say to you is really a myth based on the data that you're going to see. So as you look at this number is now anywhere from 54, 55% up to 59% oppose the system. In certain areas, if you ask certain specific questions about do you believe that there will be cost containment, etc., you see almost 70% of Americans saying this is not the solution to the budget problems that we have. So as you look at this and you move forward, the thing that I think is really important is to take a look at the dramatic growth in Medicare and Medicaid as it relates to the government and spending. The government has not done a good job of curtailing costs with Medicare and Medicaid. And so what you would hope is that you could look at data and say from 1990 or 1995 to 2010, the government has done an incredible job of reducing the cost of Medicare, Medicaid, and increasing services, increasing efficiency, increasing customer care. They've got this incredible track record. They exceed the success rate of private business. Therefore, they've earned our trust, and we should turn things over to the government. They haven't. Costs are rising faster in Medicare and Medicaid areas than in the private sector, and it now represents about 20% of the total federal budget. So Medicare and Medicaid are the stalwarts of the government program, and it's been very, very problematic to say the least. As you go through and you start to look at the systems and you analyze right here, take a look at how the costs in other countries that have single-payer systems. The cost of medical care in these countries, you look at a number of the European countries, you look at Canada, their growth in cost is almost as high as it is in the United States, with one big difference. Number one, the cost of government health care delivery is what's the higher rate in the U.S. But the other thing that a lot of people don't focus in on is that, whether you know it or not, the vast majority, depending on what category you look at, anywhere from 60 to 90% of patents in pharmaceutical sciences, in medical technology, and in things like the manufacturing and distribution of MRI machines, CAT scan machines, X-ray machines, etc. The vast majority of those technologies and those patents are held here in the United States. And in many ways, ladies and gentlemen, the U.S. healthcare system subsidizes the rest of the world. Because what happens is, most of the R&D cost is taken care of in the United States because we're willing to pay a higher price to have the best and to be first to market with pharmaceuticals or with medical technology, new equipment. And so oftentimes the cost of the R&D is paid for initially in the U.S., and the rest of the world gets it 6 months or a year or 2 years later, and the cost is lower. You think about the initial cost of a personal computer, or you look at what happened when the iPad came out. Initially it was $1,000 and it went down to $500. My dad tells the story about the first handheld calculator that he bought for his department. He bought 10 of them at Michigan Consolidated Gas, and it was $3,000 in like 1972, or $300 a computer for buying 10 of them. He gave me the same calculator when I graduated from high school and was going off to college, and that same calculator was $25. And so the initial cost, the R&D, is paid for in the market that's willing to pay that price initially. They want to be first to market. They want to be first to use. And the same thing can be said about medical technology and about pharmaceutical products. And that's a factor that a lot of times people don't realize. The vast majority of medicine that the Canadians use is not manufactured in Canada. It's manufactured in the United States. And one of the advantages of a Canadian system is when they're buying in bulk and they're buying after the initial R&D costs are taken care of. That's why Canadians can get pharmaceuticals and an American can cross the border and buy pharmaceuticals in Canada at a lower price. It's not on new drug technology, it's on older or existing drug technology that those kinds of things can take place. So when you look at these variables and you then start to take a look at Massachusetts, Governor Romney, who's now announced that he's running for president, this is the issue that everybody who might be interested in Romney becoming president or supporting Mr. Romney, this is a difficult issue that Mitt Romney has to deal with. He was the champion of a single-payer type of health care system in Massachusetts, and the results have not been very good. The costs that Mr. Romney suggested are much higher than, again, what he thought they would be. And when you look at expenses and you look at some key factors, the efficiencies haven't been there, and if you look at this whole aspect of expenditures, it's almost double the national average. So this single-payer system hasn't had the economies of scale and scope that Mr. Romney thought that it would have. As you then start to take a look at, this was a big issue. This is a big issue in the last go-round in which Mr. Obama, President Obama, was able to get a national health care system through. He pointed out that there were roughly 46 million Americans that were not insured. But if you take a look at this and you do the breakdown and you ask yourself the question, All right, let's say that we're looking at close to 46 million Americans that are not insured. You go through here and you ask yourself the question, all right, number one, the vast majority are people your age, a little bit older, a little bit younger, they're very healthy, and is it as big a concern that you don't have health care as it is for somebody like me who's 53 and overweight and you know, potentially could have some big health issues? If you look here at the fact that we're talking about there are 12 million children and in some cases their parents that are eligible for existing government programs but have simply not signed up. And when they sign up, they would be part of a program that already exists. You look at this particular fact, we have roughly 10 million Americans that are immigrants that are not eligible for health care under the current government rules anyway. And 5.5 million of those people, based on some very good statistical analysis, are illegal aliens, illegal immigrants, and aren't supposed to be here anyway. And then as you go through and you look at a large-scale portion, or basically the rest of the number, these are individuals that have household incomes that afford them the opportunity to be able to buy health care. You know, as you look at those statistics, a large number of these households are making more than $75,000 a year and simply choose not to have health care. So when we say that all of these people are uninsured, it's important that you look at just the facts and you say to yourself, if we want to make certain that these people are insured, why should we create a system that it seems like our focal point is that 45 to 46 million people, rather than the rest of the almost 310 million people in this country that seem to be happy with, that like, and can afford the health care system. So again, like Social Security, what I'm suggesting to you is the vast majority of people, the current system works. And it is, without a doubt, the best health care system in the world. And this is very sound scientific research. You know, I'm overweight. You can look at me. I'm comfortable with who I am. Bottom line is I need to lose weight. And if you factor out those of us in the United States that are obese, that are overweight, you take that out of the data, because America is one of the most obese countries in the world. There are a lot of us that live the good life, make excuses, don't work out, eat too much. And if you extrapolate out the cost of that from health care, the United States life expectancy is the highest in the world by almost 2.5 years. And one of the reasons why we have the highest life expectancy is because we lead the world in heart research. We lead the world in cancer research. Last year alone, almost 10,000 Canadians from Ontario crossed the different borders of Michigan and came into Michigan to have needed heart surgery because they couldn't get in the queue on a timely basis to have it done in Canada. Now, there are a lot of good things about the Canadian system, and I'm not here to downgrade or debate the Canadian system, but those are honest-to-goodness facts that when you look at the United States and you look at the fact that people that are overweight, it's not a failure of a health care system. It is a failure of individual responsibility, and changing a health care system one way or the other is not going to change obesity, because there are a lot of countries that have nationalized health care systems that are even more obese than the United States. So the fact of the matter is that as you look at the system, you know, the facts are pretty obvious as it relates to what do we need to do to make things better. And what I would suggest to you is that when you look at the healthcare system and you think about those that are uninsured, a large percentage of those people have enough household income to be able to afford to buy it. They choose not to. And the other factor is the vast majority of people are transitory. We don't have many people that are uninsured for a long period of time. Less than 2.5% of that whole almost 46 million are uninsured for more than a couple of years. So there's also that transitory nature of people have insurance, they don't have insurance. They want insurance, they choose not to have insurance. And again, is it the role of government to say you must have insurance or you don't need insurance, or we're going to make that decision for you? Now, as you think about it then, there are a number of suggestions that you can make to deal with some of the short-term problems that would be a much better decision-making process, in my opinion, than the national health care that we're looking at with the Obama administration. One of you asked me before I began my talk, do I hope the federal court or ultimately the Supreme Court overturns the legislation? The answer is yes. But it doesn't mean that I don't agree with the president that there are health care problems. I would just like to see us look at some of these as an intermediate step, educate the population, and then over the long term, I'd like to see us move more toward a market process similar to Dr. Reisman's arguments with privatizing Social Security, or some of the suggestions Dr. Ebling made in his Q&A session this morning. Okay? So first of all, as you look here, I would say to you, the United States is, again, the most inventive and innovative program of health care, has the most innovative and inventive program in the world. And the problem with a single-payer system is you dramatically reduce or you eliminate competition. The beauty of the U.S. system is there's tremendous competition among and between the pharmaceutical companies. There's tremendous competition among and between the medical technology companies. And you folks may be a little bit too young, but if, a great topic for you to look at or maybe do a research paper on is, not too many years ago during the Clinton administration, a private company decided that it was going to go out and map the human genome. This private company said, we are going to map how your DNA interacts at the micro, the basic level. In other words, what is it that makes up a human being? And there are some people a lot smarter than I that say once you've mapped the human genome, you could reconstruct or you could construct a human being. But at the base level of the human genome, the argument is that this could be literally the fountain of youth or the fountain of eternal life. Because once you unlock the human genome, most scientists say that there are ways to do everything from rebuild, reprogram the aging process, to take a heart that is defective and reprogram the literal genetic makeup and solve that problem. There's a young man that I knew in Midland who was an incredibly brilliant kid, took a few classes at Northwood in economics and accounting in the summer, ended up getting his PhD from MIT and undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan, and is working on genomic sciences right now. Last time I saw him a few years ago, they literally were taking genetic material, and if you lost a tooth in an automobile accident, they had come to the point where they were taking and constructing the enamel from your blood, from just simple blood. And they had the enamel in one petri dish and they had the pulp in the other, but they hadn't quite figured out how to get them together. But in essence, he said he thought by 2015 that they would literally be able to grow substitute teeth. And he says, once we figure out teeth, then if you lost an arm in an automobile accident, he thought that it wasn't too far down the road that they could literally grow a substitute arm. That's where we're going with this incredibly exciting science. And it was during the Clinton administration when you folks were just, maybe just beyond twinkles in your parents' eyes, that a private company beat the government, spent less than 1/20th what the government spent, and beat the government in the race to map the human genome. That's the private sector going after it with much less money, and then basically President Clinton declared it a tie and said we're going to share the information. But my point is, that's the private sector. That's the market doing these incredible things, that allow for invention and innovation. And it's why life expectancy has basically doubled in this country in 100 years. So that's my worry with a national health care system, that we do away with the invention and the innovation that this country still leads the world in. You know, to Michael Cox's presentation last night, we're no longer the leaders the way we used to be in the automobile industry. We're way ahead in medical technology, but that too could wane if we do away with the freedom that these medical entrepreneurs still have. Second point is tort law reform. Third is interstate competition. Fourth is tax reform. And fifth is technology. Okay? So I went over what I wanted you to look at in terms of invention and innovation. These are just some of the points that I made. And if you look at tort law reform, and you think about this, conservative economic analysis tells us that we have frivolous lawsuits that add at least $200 billion a year annually to the cost of medical care, because we sue over things that just don't make sense. Now, I'm not opposed to lawyers representing people that have been harmed by an irresponsible pharmaceutical company, an irresponsible manufacturer of medical equipment, or an irresponsible doctor. But in this country, ladies and gentlemen, we sue more often than any other country in the world. You are 8 times more likely in business or in your personal life to be sued in the United States than you are in Japan. You are 5 times more likely to be sued in your business or your personal life in the United States than you are in Europe. And it's the regulatory and the legal environment that is truly making the United States a much less desirable place to do business. And so when you think about it today, you know, you study in your macroeconomics courses, you study tax policy, you study spending policy, you look at monetary policy. But an area that I worry about more and more each day is regulatory cost and regulatory policy. And we're suing people way too often and at costs that are very damaging. And most people will say that it's the worry about these lawsuits that doctors have many more tests run than you actually need, because they're worried about being sued, and that's a counter to the lawsuit. Or I'll give you a personal example. My wife Pam's sister Sharon is an OBGYN surgeon, and she was in South Bend, Indiana. And she was on the staff at Notre Dame's medical school, and she had her own private practice. Taught part-time at Notre Dame, had her own practice. And her husband, Brent, was a vice president, and he was in charge of sales for dietetics products for Miles Laboratories. And Dow Chemical approached Brent, headhunter, wanted him to come to Midland, and wanted him to take a look at coming to work at Dow Chemical. And this goes back about 12 years ago, before we passed some needed tort law reform in the state of Michigan. So you know, obviously they're a dual income household. Brent had a great job, Sharon had a great job, and he turned down Dow, didn't even come to Midland, didn't even have the conversation. Because when they looked at the cost of malpractice insurance for Sharon, Sharon's never been sued, never had a legal inquiry about her competency as a doctor. And her medical malpractice insurance was going to go from $48,000 in Indiana to over $200,000 in Michigan. And she'd never been sued, she'd never had one wrongful action. But that's what it's like from state to state. It differs so dramatically in terms of the medical malpractice. And so we need to have tort law reform where we do not allow people to sue for frivolous things or have uncapped notions of what pain and suffering happens to be. And that becomes a problem here in the U.S. We have to say that you can't sue for all the things that we're suing for, because it's dramatically increasing the cost of medicine. And again, if a doctor makes a mistake and a family member of yours is harmed, there ought to be recourse for you. The problem is the recourse doesn't oftentimes fit the inefficient action on the part of the doctor. And in many cases, what happens is they're sued for things that they weren't even their responsibility. There was a case where Dow Chemical, before they sold a lot of their pharmaceutical products, they had a product called benzene, or Benedictine, which is a derivative, I think, of that product. And it was a product that was given to mothers when they were pregnant and they had nausea. It was during, the period where you have the morning sickness. And so anyway, the baby was born of this mother, and the mother had a baby now that was born without any fingers on one hand, only one finger on the other hand, and was missing 2 toes on each of her 2 feet. And of course, she was shocked. She was a single parent, and hired an attorney. And the attorney quickly said, well, this must be the cause of this product produced by the Dow Chemical Company. So Dow was sued. A jury here in Detroit awarded the mother $28 million. Dow's good name was harmed, and now Dow had to go to court, had to sue a single-parent welfare mother, and what they ended up finding out was that she had been addicted to crack cocaine, and that, in essence, when it got to the appeals court and there was more scientific evidence, the end result is that the decision was reversed. But you look at all the time, the negative publicity, and the fact that now Dow turns around, and who's Dow going to sue? This mother had nothing. She had been ill-advised by an attorney. And in a lot of these cases, it would make sense if we had lawsuits, and in the United States, like in many European countries, that you could go after the lawyer who was filing the frivolous lawsuit. Because you look at all the time and all the effort that companies put in, either with defensive medicine or the inappropriate amounts of time and effort and money that they spend protecting themselves against these lawsuits. All right? Now, next is to take a look at it, and Dr. Ebeling touched on some of this, but here's a real problem. When you look at buying insurance, whether you realize it or not, you can buy your life insurance across state borders. There's nothing that says you can't buy life insurance from another country or from Oregon or Washington. You may have your auto insurance from a company that is not located in the state of Michigan. And yet, you can't do that with health insurance. There are a lot of rules and a lot of protections, and so as a result, as you look here, you start to analyze the fact that if there was competition across state borders, that in and of itself would reduce the cost. Tort Law Reform would reduce the cost, and being able to have pure competition, or a much closer form of competition to pure competition. Because if you look at this, in New Jersey, for a healthy 25-year-old male, when we did this study, so this is 2006 data, it was the most recent we could get, it was almost $6,000 to buy basic coverage in New Jersey. You could get the exact same coverage where there is much less government regulation, much more open competition, much more of a cafeteria plan. You can get it in Kentucky, the base coverage, for $1,000. And so if you could just buy across state boundaries, you would force open competition, and you'd force the excessively high costs in a state like New Jersey to come down. Now, your next question ought to be, well, Nash, what about the fact that in many of these states, there are mandates? And if you want to read, I think the best medical economist in the country is at the National Center for Policy Analysis in Dallas, and his name is John Goodman. And if you decide you want to write one of your papers on health care or medical reform, after you read our white paper, go to the National Center for Policy Analysis and look at Dr. Goodman's good work. And I remember being at a seminar where John spoke a few years ago, and he said, if you took all the state mandates across the country, there are a total of over 400 different mandates. And some states have the same mandates, and some have more, and others have less. But you realize in 26 states, you want basic health care, all right? The notion of a cafeteria plan does not exist in most states. And what we mean by a cafeteria plan is you go through the cafeteria and you say, I want the peas, but I don't want the corn. I want a hamburger, but I don't want anything other than mustard on it. I want the baked beans, but I don't want the lima beans. And you choose what you want. You construct your meal, you get to the end, and then you pay the price. In most states, it's like this. You have to have the lima beans, you have to have the baked beans, you have to have the nacho sauce on your hamburger, and you have no choice with the items that you're going to have. And in essence, you don't get what you want, and the costs go up. So, give you an example. In 25 out of 50 states, it's mandated in the base health care plan that you have to provide for hair transplant surgery. Now, a guy like me, that might be useful. A guy like Dr. Ebling, why should he have to pay for it? You know, he came out of his mom's womb with that much hair. Or if you look at basic health care coverage, do you realize that in 26 out of 50 states, a Catholic nun who wants base health care would have to have what? Come on, say it. Okay, I'll say it. Would have to have maternity or pregnancy coverage. Now, the nun goes in to negotiate with her insurance provider. I'm a Catholic nun. I took a vow of celibacy. I don't have sex, don't want to have sex, don't think I like sex. I'm going to hell. But she has to what? She has to have that basic coverage. So the notion is that some states, like Kentucky, are real close to a cafeteria plan. There are very few special interests, very few mandates, and you can get that coverage at $1,000. New Jersey, you know, you gotta see Snooki, you know, you have to have all these other things that they put in the health care plan, and it drives it through the roof. You can't get the basic plan that you want. And the problem is, it's not in many cases the companies, it's the state regulations that are in place. And then the only way that you can say, well, if the state's going to mandate these things, then the state passes a law that doesn't allow you to buy the state coverage from any other state than that state that you're in. And if you had open competition, if you were allowed to sell across borders, it would dramatically reduce the cost, it would increase competition, and companies would either reduce the mandates to compete or they'd go out of business. Just like there's much greater competition, much lower prices, much more efficiency, like Richard mentioned, because of the competition in the automobile industry of being able to buy insurance across state borders. Okay? Now, as you look at it in terms of taxation, if you go back and look at that data that I gave you regarding those that are uninsured, the vast majority of the problems could be solved. Instead of saying we're going to create a single-payer national health care system for all 308 million of us based on the last census, let's deal with those 45 or 46 million people. 12 million of them, we said, would be covered by existing government programs. 10 million of those folks are illegal immigrants and should not be, are either immigrants or illegal immigrants and are not eligible for the government plan right now anyway. And so the vast majority of those folks, 20-some million, that have, maybe are self-employed or choose not to take the company benefit that's provided them, or their company doesn't offer them a health care benefit. Wouldn't it be a lot more logical to say, for that few number of people, we're going to offer them tax credits? Instead of revamping the whole system, creating a single-payer system that's going to at least curtail, if not destroy, the competitive advantage that we have with an invention and innovation that I spoke of earlier, wouldn't we be better off just to say, if we really have a problem, let's give those folks some tax credits if they really don't have the system or can't afford it? It's a lot less costly and a lot more expensive, and a lot less expensive and a lot more efficient to allow them to have a market-driven system rather than, and buy insurance from the private sector, rather than having all of us under a government system. And that's the truth. For the 85% of the American population that has health care, it is, without a doubt, the best, the greatest system in the world. So even if you think that there's a problem and there's a role for government, my belief is that the role for government can be, should end at this point. Tax credits. And you will take care of the vast majority of people. And then, as Dr. Ebling pointed out, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. If people don't want health care, that's their choice. And in the end, a couple of tragedies of somebody refusing to use the tax credits, refusing to take health care, and those families would go through some difficult times that would be horrendous. But in the end, that would prevent most people from ever doing anything other than taking advantage of the structure that would give them health care. All right. So as you go through and you look at it, the other thing that I think is important to take a look at is that better use of technology. There's a tremendous amount of information out there. There's a tremendous amount of invention and innovation that's taking place where you could share a lot of information. If Keith were here, I'd ask him if I could talk to an investment that he's involved with where there's a couple of companies that have come up with some cutting-edge computer technology to share information. And right now there are some federal laws and some Privacy Act data that prevent it, but you can go on the website of Consumer Reports and find out what people and experts think about automobiles and dishwashers and what they think about iPads, what they think about personal computers, a whole list of products. Why not do it with medical technology? Why not look at customer satisfaction ratings and make them public? Why not look at doctors' records on surgery and the success of surgery? All of that information is out there. Can it and should it be shared? Yeah, it's available. The technology now exists. We ought to make that out, let that be available so that people can make more informed decisions. Richard's point about Hayek's use of knowledge in society from when we are free. The more knowledge that's out there, the more people will make sound, rational decisions. So, as you look at these are, I think, reforms that would have solved the vast majority, if not all, of our health care problems, and we did not have an administration that wanted to hear this. The administration was hell-bent on getting through a system that was the beginning of a single-payer health care system, and it's not an effective, it's not an efficient way to solve our problems. But in my opinion, this is a short-term fix. I think that as we look at health care over the long term, we need to look at solutions that will take us to a much higher level of competency and efficiency. And what I mean by that is, I truly believe that what most of you want is a base insurance that insures you against catastrophe. And if you think about automobile insurance as an example, you buy automobile insurance and you hope you never use it. True or false? True. And you buy automobile insurance because you hope that you never use it because you don't want to be in an accident. And you're insuring against the ultimate problem, an accident. Because you say, boy, an accident, especially with a new vehicle, I couldn't afford to replace the automobile if it was a severe accident. But when you look at some of the things and some of the insurance packages that we have, the parallel with automobile insurance would be, well, I'm buying the catastrophic insurance, but I'm going to buy muffler repair insurance. I'm going to buy tune-up insurance. I'm going to buy oil change insurance. I'm going to buy gas insurance. And again, those things don't exist. You buy insurance, and for the most part, whether it's life insurance or automobile insurance or insurance on your home, you buy it for the reason for insurance, to insure against the catastrophe. And then all the other things you work out. When you buy insurance on your home, you don't buy insurance for lawn maintenance. You don't buy insurance for plumbing. You don't buy insurance for upkeep or maid service. You know, these are all things that you could parallel to all these mandates that we oftentimes have state by state with health care insurance. So, you know, Dr. Ebling's point about getting down to the basics is really important. And getting close to the individual that is the customer and the service provider, moving and removing as many barricades as is humanly possible. And that's what you do with automobile insurance. That's what you do with home insurance. You know, you're insuring against that catastrophe, but then most of the maintenance on your car or your home, you take care of yourself. You take care of engine repairs if it's out of warranty. You take care of the gasoline, the oil change, the maintenance. You take care of the painting of your home, the addition to the home, the upkeep, etc. And so that's really, you know, in the end, in many ways, I would like to see us say that we have a difficulty today with being a high-tax country. As I say to my students on a regular basis, and I don't teach as much as I would like to. I'm the vice president of, as I mentioned to you last night, strategic and corporate alliances, and privileged to work with Richard and be the Fry Endowed Chair in free market economics. But as I take a look at it, what I love most about teaching is to get students to understand that, again, one of the most important words in economics is the word relative. Because what's important is you're not talking about your brother, your sister, your cousin, your uncle. You're talking about in comparison to. And we are becoming a high-tax, high-regulatory country. And when you look at benefits, we could cut taxes dramatically and take away the tax advantage of giving health care as a benefit. We could take away that tax advantage on individuals or for corporations, and that would force customers, all of us as consumers of health care, to then seek the basic, that catastrophic health care. And then those that wanted to pay a higher premium because maybe they have diabetes in their family or maybe they have certain issues, there would be insurance and markets to take care of those individuals. But then deal with the doctor on a one-on-one basis. Pay for your doctor's visits. If you were paying for doctor's visits, you'd be a lot less likely to go to the doctor for frivolous things, and you'd be a lot more likely to complain to a pharmaceutical company or to the physician if you thought you were being overcharged. And you would be a lot more likely to talk to your friends about, hey, I've got a doctor, I don't think he's very good or she's very good, can you recommend somebody else? Or, boy, my doctor, she's top drawer, you ought to go and see her. But we have removed a lot of the personal touch and the market signals with our existing healthcare system. And so I would argue that what we really need to do is move toward a more market-based system. We need to say to ourselves, let's cut out a lot of the advantages from a tax perspective that benefit that really came about because of wage and price controls for the most part in this country during World War II, and let's restore that closeness that relationship between customer and service provider or doctor and patient that a market system would allow. And as we look at it, I'll guarantee you that if we take those 5 reforms that I mentioned earlier, especially tort law reform and being able to buy across state borders, and then we said we're going to cut taxes and we are going to allow you to buy basic catastrophic insurance and then negotiate for most other things, you know what you'd even find over time? My guess is that medical IRAs in many cases would replace people buying catastrophic insurance. You'd have medical IRAs that you would put money in every year, and maybe there's a tax incentive to do that. But all of you young people, you could either buy a pooled medical IRA or you could have an individualized medical IRA. But the vast majority of you will realize that you could have hundreds of thousands of dollars in your medical IRA before you get to a point that you ever needed those dollars. And if you look at some of the research, if you didn't have health issues for a long period of time, you could use some of those medical IRA dollars for other assets. Or you could stop paying into the system or borrow from your medical IRA because it was so well funded. One of my kids asked me over the weekend, he says, "Dad, what do you think about auto insurance?" And I have to say I've been pretty blessed with 4 kids, my wife and I, and we've had very few automobile accidents. And every year I look at what we paid over the years when we had 4 kids that were on our policy and they were of different ages. And then my wife and I, and we paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for medical or for automobile insurance and collected on 1 accident in the entire 2 accidents in the entire history of the kids being on our automobile insurance. But we did it because we were super risk averse and didn't want to deal with some of the other problems. And so there are multiple ways to take a look at whether you use insurance, how you use insurance, the type of insurance you have, having a medical IRA. A lot of companies and organizations, universities are self-insuring on a lot of their insurance because they're saying, when I truly understand the risk factor, I'll have a big, in essence, medical IRA. We'll save up dollars, and over a longer period of time, we're better off being self-insured, insuring for the catastrophic, and then letting our employees operate and negotiate on a regular basis with the hospital or with the physician. But I think over time, the trend will be that organizations are going to get out of the business if the government allows them to, and each of us will move toward buying our own insurance if we buy it, opting for a medical IRA, and getting close to the doctor to bring down a lot of these costs. Because it's ridiculous what the cost is in many of these cases as it relates to hospitals and doctors trying to extrapolate their risks with lawsuits and costs over many patients. And so my concluding remarks before I take questions are that I really believe that as you look at what we're facing today, we have problems in healthcare, but they're not problems that couldn't be solved much more effectively and efficiently by some of the market solutions that I'm suggesting. And I just hope that the courts rule the way I think they will, and that is to strike down some or all of Mr. Obama's health care, and that we begin to negotiate some real, true, lasting market reforms that will bring down costs, increase health care efficiency, and quite frankly, make the U.S. a lot more attractive than it is with regard to health care. Thank you very much. Questions? Anyone? No questions? Yes?
I have a question. Mostly when you hear the U.S. compare their healthcare to other nations, usually it's Canada or the UK. Do you think that sometimes that the U.S. kind of is naive not to look at some of the other countries that are doing
What countries would you suggest?
Like France or Sweden or...
Yeah, I would say the data that I've seen, it does not bode well for France or for Sweden or for Norway in terms of those costs. If you look at it, the costs in France and Sweden, I just touched on a little bit with one of those slides, but take a look at the paper that we wrote if you want more data. But you know, they're not doing better in terms of the healthcare costs. And you know, the thing that you cannot debate is that, you know, some of the things that I chose to ignore during the time frame is, you know, just the ability. I mentioned the one example of heart surgery in the United States. I could name multiple, we mentioned them in the paper, multiple leaders in Italy and France and a number of European countries that when they needed key cancer surgery, they needed key heart surgery, there's one country they came to, and it wasn't France, and it wasn't Sweden, it was the United States. And so you look at a lot of government leaders, you look at when people around the world are looking for the best and the most innovative and the most efficient, they come here. You look at examples of people you know, waiting or needing to wait for a certain knee surgery or necessary heart surgery or cancer treatments, etc. You know, the United States has the best and most efficient system in the world. It is lacking for that roughly 15% that are either underfunded or don't have insurance. So you know, we're not a perfect system, and we do need reform, and we do need to look at how we can do things better. But in terms of an overall system for the vast majority of Americans, I'd say, you know, not trying to wave the American flag, it is without a doubt the best system, the most inventive, the most innovative system that at least that I'm aware of. Other thoughts? Go ahead. I can't see anything with these lights.
Do you believe the way intellectual property rights are set up right now, that they unfairly favor the big firms and the companies?
In what way? It's an interesting question, but I'm...
By their ownership of the building design, whatever, they're allowed to charge a high premium when there's really less other competition, and it's creating a monopoly for that one drug for a certain amount of time.
For the existence of the patent, you mean? Yeah, see, it's interesting. I'm certainly not a legal scholar. I wish Keith were here. Your president has his Juris Doctorate in law, if you didn't know that. But I would say this. In the free market movement, there are a lot of free market economists that believe in patents and copyrights and intellectual property, and there are others that don't. I happen to believe in intellectual property rights. So, you know, the argument is, you know, the first base argument is, should you have a patent? Should patents exist for intellectual property? And I think the answer is yes. I think that if you go out there and you spend the kind of money in terms of R&D and research, I doubt that the incentive would be there if I wasn't going to have my R&D protected. You know, I wouldn't put money in investing in a new technology if I wasn't going to have some competitive advantage. I mean, what would be the incentive for me to spend hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars investing in a new technology is if as soon as I finished inventing it, anybody had the same rights to it that I have. It failed in the old Soviet Union. It failed in communist countries. You know, the collapse of the Berlin Wall and communism, a lot of it had to do with the fact that they weren't inventing, they weren't innovative, they weren't leading the world in any technology because there was no incentive for it to exist. So I'm a believer in intellectual property at base. I think to your question, are patents lasting 19 years and being able to re-up on patents, is that too long? And I think that there's debate. I don't understand why 19 years was chosen. So, you know, maybe it's better to have a patent for 10 years or 15 years. But, you know, I do support patents, and I'd be up for a great discussion on whether a 19-year patent is too long, or should it be longer, or should it be shorter. So I would say that I don't think it gives the company an undeserved advantage, would be my opinion. Other thoughts, questions? Yes, sir.
Do you think that we will see competition from other
I certainly hope so. It's not. It's a little bit more complex than I'd like it to be, but you know, there's this debate on whether or not you can have, you know, is this an interstate commerce clause issue? And again, I'm not a lawyer, but if it applies to automobile insurance, I don't understand why it doesn't apply to medical insurance. And there are a lot of people much brighter than I am that have argued. You know, I remember when I got to know Milton Friedman and he wrote the foreword to When We Are Free. It was I met him because one of our students that I was advising ended up being a finalist in the Milton Friedman essay contest, and we were flown to Stanford. I was his faculty advisor, so we got to spend a lot of time with Dr. Friedman. And you know, his argument was that you know, as you take a look at a lot of the changes, you need to have a true market process for these changes, but that you know, that it ought to happen as quickly and as seamlessly as possible. And his point was that if you can, he saw no reason why if you can buy a life insurance and automobile insurance across state borders, why can't you do it with medical insurance? And so I would hope that that becomes a proposal that would argue to stop it from happening interferes with interstate commerce, and that's a good role of the federal government in that case would be to give people the choice to be able to buy it across state borders. So I would hope that that reform would not take very long. And I would like to see something like that happen overnight. Anybody else? No? Okay, well, if you have any other questions, I'm around. Thank you very much. And we need to be back in here at 6 o'clock for